If you visited Venezuela in the 1970s, you weren't visiting a developing nation. You were visiting the future. The currency was so strong that the middle class would fly to Paris just to buy groceries because it was cheaper than shopping at home. They called it "da barato, dame dos." It's cheap, give me two. They had the Concorde jet landing at their airport. They had more oil than Saudi Arabia. They had the highest GDP in Latin America. They were, statistically, the envy of the world. Venezuelan families would vacation in Miami and New York like Americans vacation in Mexico. A doctor in Caracas made more money than a doctor in Madrid. The shopping malls were filled with French perfume, Italian leather, and American electronics, all cheaper than in their countries of origin. Fast forward to January 12, 2026. The average Venezuelan has lost 20 pounds of body weight because they cannot afford food. The currency is so worthless that artists use the banknotes to weave handbags because the paper is worth more as a craft than as money. Mothers pay for milk with gold jewelry melted down from their wedding rings. And, as of last week, the president who oversaw this collapse is sitting in a federal holding cell in New York City, captured by U.S. Special Forces in a raid that shocked the world. How does a country go from flying the Concorde to fighting for bread in one generation? How do you have 300 billion barrels of oil under your feet and still run out of gasoline? How do you go from being called Saudi Venezuela to having 7 million of your citizens flee the country, the largest migration crisis in Latin American history? This isn't just a story about socialism or capitalism. It is a story about the most dangerous drug in the financial world, easy money. To understand the poverty of today, you have to understand the insanity of the wealth back then. In the 1950s, Venezuela was the fourth wealthiest nation per capita on Earth. Let me repeat that. Fourth, richer than Japan, richer than Spain, richer than New Zealand. Only the United States, Switzerland, and Kuwait were ahead of them. The world was thirsty for oil, and Venezuela had a bottomless cup. They had Lake Maracaibo, an inland sea so full of oil that you could literally see it bubbling to the surface. They had the Orinoco Belt, tar sands so vast that geologists couldn't believe the readings. The government didn't even know how to spend the money fast enough. They built massive highways that connected the mountains to the coast. They erected brutalist skyscrapers that dominated the Caracas skyline. They constructed the Teresa Carreño Theater, an architectural masterpiece that seated 3,000 people and hosted the world's greatest orchestras. Caracas was known as Los Angeles of South America. It had the sophistication of Paris, the energy of New York, and the weather of eternal spring. The restaurants served Spanish cuisine prepared by chefs trained in Barcelona. The nightclubs played salsa until dawn. The universities attracted students from across Latin America. The middle class grew so fast that economists coined a new term, the Venezuelan miracle. But right here, in the middle of the party, the cancer started growing. Economists call it the Dutch disease. Here is how it works. When you have so much oil money flooding into your country, your currency becomes incredibly strong. This sounds great, right? Wrong. Because the currency was so strong, it became cheaper to import everything than to make it yourself. Why build a shoe factory in Caracas when you can import Nike shoes from America for pennies on the dollar? Why grow corn when you can buy it from Iowa for less than it costs to plant seeds? Why manufacture textiles when Bangladesh will ship you finished shirts for nothing? Venezuelan farmers couldn't compete with subsidized American agriculture. Venezuelan factories couldn't compete with Chinese manufacturing. Venezuelan businesses couldn't compete with anyone because their own currency had become their enemy. Slowly, without anyone noticing, Venezuela stopped making things. They stopped farming, they stopped manufacturing, they stopped innovating. They became a nation that did only one thing: sell oil and buy stuff. By 1970, Venezuela was importing 70% of its food. They were importing machinery, cars, clothes, medicine, everything. The entire economy had become a gigantic import business funded by oil exports. Imagine if your personal income came from one job and you used that income to buy everything, including food, shelter, and medicine. Now imagine that job could fire you at any moment. That was Venezuela. But the people didn't see the danger. Why would they? Times were good. The restaurants were full. The malls were packed. The future looked bright. By 1976, the government looked at the oil industry and had a thought. Why are foreign companies making money from our oil? President Carlos Andrés Pérez, a charismatic populist, decided that this oil was too important to be left to private companies. So, on January 1st, 1976, he nationalized it. They created PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., the state oil company. At first, it worked. The oil experts stayed. The engineers who had worked for Exxon and Shell were hired by PDVSA at even higher salaries. The money kept flowing. In fact, production increased. But the government had just given itself a blank check. And when politicians have a blank check, they don't save for a rainy day. They buy votes. They expanded the welfare state. They subsidized gasoline until it was cheaper than bottled water. Literally, you could fill up your tank for less than $1. They subsidized electricity, public transportation, and housing. They gave away loans with negative real interest rates. The corruption was spectacular. Government officials would approve contracts for inflated prices and pocket the difference. They would create fake projects that existed only on paper. They would import goods at the official exchange rate and resell them at black market prices, making 1,000% profit overnight. But none of this mattered because the oil money covered everything. Until 1998. The Asian financial crisis hit. Russia defaulted on its debt. The global economy convulsed, and the price of oil crashed from $25 a barrel to $10. The party stopped. The government couldn't pay for the subsidies anymore. Banks collapsed. Unemployment spiked. The middle class that had flown to Paris for groceries was now struggling to pay rent. The people were angry. They had been promised prosperity forever. They had been told that Venezuela was special, that the oil would never run out, that the good times would never end. And when people are angry, they look for a savior. Enter Hugo Chavez. Chavez was a former Army lieutenant colonel who had attempted a coup in 1992 and failed. He spent 2 years in prison where he read Bolivar, Marx, and Mao. When he was released, he didn't pick up a gun again. He picked up a microphone. He was charismatic in a way that Venezuelan politics had never seen. He didn't speak like a politician. He spoke like a preacher. He would go on television for 5, 6, 7 hours at a time, riffing, joking, singing, and preaching. He looked the people in the eye and said, "You are poor because the rich stole your oil. You are hungry because the oligarchs took your wealth. Vote for me and I will give you back what is yours." He won the 1998 election by a landslide, 56% of the vote. And then he got lucky. Unbelievably, impossibly lucky. Right after Chavez took power, the price of oil went parabolic. It went from $10 a barrel in 1999 to $140 a barrel in 2008. It was the greatest lottery win in history. Venezuela was suddenly swimming in more cash than they had ever seen. Chavez took this money and spent it on a scale that is hard to comprehend. He launched the Misiones, social missions. Mission Robinson taught 1 million adults how to read. Mission Barrio Adentro brought Cuban doctors into the slums to provide free health care. Mission Mercal sold subsidized food at 40% below market prices. Mission Vivienda built hundreds of thousands of housing units. He gave away refrigerators, washing machines, and televisions. He paid people's electricity bills. He increased the minimum wage by 400%. He reduced poverty by almost 50% in his first decade in power. For the poor, the majority of Venezuelans, Hugo Chavez was a hero. He was Robin Hood with an oil well. But he made a fatal mistake. He treated the oil company PDVSA like a piggy bank, not a business. In 2002 to 2003, PDVSA workers went on strike. They were protesting Chávez's increasing political control over the company. They wanted PDVSA to remain a professional, merit-based organization. Chávez responded by firing 18,000 employees. Let me be clear, these weren't janitors and secretaries. These were petroleum engineers, geologists, project managers, and technicians. These were the people who knew how to extract oil from 2 miles underground. These were the people who understood the complex chemistry of refining crude into gasoline. He replaced them with political loyalists who knew nothing about drilling for oil. He appointed military officers with no engineering background to run refineries. He turned PDVSA into a jobs program for his supporters. And he stopped reinvesting in the machinery. PDVSA had always reinvested 30 to 40% of its revenue into maintenance, exploration, and new technology. Under Chávez, that number dropped to 5%. He took the other 35% and spent it on social programs. Imagine you own a Ferrari taxi service. You are making a ton of money driving people around. But instead of changing the oil, replacing the brake pads, and buying new tires, you take all the profit and buy champagne for your friends. For a while, the Ferrari keeps running on momentum. Eventually, it breaks down. That is exactly what happened to the Venezuelan oil industry. Production started to drop. In 1998, Venezuela was producing 3.5 million barrels per day. By 2013, it had dropped to 2.5 million. But nobody cared because the price of oil was so high that they were still making money. The infrastructure was rusting, the wells were aging, the refineries were operating with duct tape and prayers. But as long as oil was above $100 a barrel, the government could paper over the cracks. Until 2014. In March 2013, Hugo Chávez died of cancer. He handpicked his successor, a former bus driver and union organizer named Nicolás Maduro. Maduro inherited the presidency at the worst possible moment in history. In 2014, the price of oil collapsed. The U.S. shale revolution had unleashed millions of new barrels onto the market. OPEC refused to cut production. The price went from $100 a barrel to $40. Venezuela's income was cut in half overnight. But they still had to pay for all the free food, the free housing, the subsidies, and the bloated government payroll that Chávez had created. A normal government would have cut spending. They would have reformed PDVSA. They would have diversified the economy. They would have said, sorry, we are broke, and we need to make some difficult decisions. But Maduro couldn't do that. His entire power came from giving things away. If he cut the subsidies, the people would turn on him. So he did the only thing he could think of. He printed money. When you print money without producing goods, you get inflation. Prices started to rise, slowly at first. 5%, then 10%, then 20%. So Maduro did something even dumber. He instituted price controls. In 2014, he passed a law saying that a loaf of bread could only cost 10 bolivars. Milk could only cost 15 bolivars. Toilet paper could only cost 20 bolivars. He thought he could fight the laws of supply and demand by decree. What happens when it costs a baker 50 bolivars to make bread, but the law says he can only sell it for 10 bolivars? He stops making bread. What happens when it costs a farmer more to produce milk than he can sell it for? He stops producing milk. What happens when stores are legally required to sell goods at a loss? They close. The shelves went empty. The pharmacies ran out of medicine. The factory shut down. The supply chain collapsed like a row of dominoes. And the government's solution? Print more money. By 2016, inflation was 800%. By 2017, it was 2,600%. By 2018, it wasn't 10% or 20% or even 1,000%. It was 1,000,000%. Let me put that in perspective. If you had saved 1,000,000 bolivars in January 2018, enough to buy a car, by December, it was enough to buy a cup of coffee. Not even a large coffee, a small coffee. This is where the stories get tragic. People would wake up at 3 a.m. to stand in line at the grocery store, hoping that a delivery truck might arrive. They would wait for 8, 10, 12 hours. Sometimes the truck came, sometimes it didn't. When it did come, fights would break out. People would rush the truck. Store employees would start selling goods out the back door to friends and family before they ever made it to the shelves. The black market exploded. If you had connections, if you knew someone in the military or the government, you could get food. If you didn't, you starved. People would carry backpacks full of cash just to buy a carton of eggs. The money was losing value so fast that shopkeepers stopped counting it. They started weighing it on scales. A pound of cash for a pound of rice. Mothers would feed their children dinner and then skip their own meal, claiming they weren't hungry. Families would scavenge through garbage looking for scraps. Zoo animals were slaughtered and eaten because there was no other meat available. This was the era of the Maduro diet. The average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds in 2017 simply because there was no food. Doctors reported seeing diseases they hadn't seen in 50 years: malnutrition, rickets, and kwashiorkor. The richest country in South America was starving. The hospitals ran out of medicine. Cancer patients couldn't get chemotherapy. Diabetics couldn't get insulin. Surgeons were operating without anesthesia. Women were dying in childbirth from infections because there were no antibiotics. The exodus began. Venezuelans started walking, literally walking, out of the country. They would walk for weeks across Colombia to get to Ecuador. They would walk to Peru, to Chile, to Argentina. 7 million Venezuelans, 1/4 of the population, fled the country. It was the largest migration crisis in the history of Latin America. Those who stayed behind turned to cryptocurrency. Desperate Venezuelans became some of the world's most sophisticated Bitcoin traders, not because they were tech enthusiasts, but because they needed a currency that actually held value. By 2020, the Venezuelan bolivar was effectively dead. The government finally gave up and informally adopted the US dollar. This created a bizarre zombie economy that lasted until last week. If you had access to dollars, maybe from a relative in Miami, maybe from working online, maybe from the black market, you lived like a king. You could eat at fancy restaurants in the Las Mercedes district of Caracas, which looked like Dubai. You could shop at luxury stores that sold imported whiskey and designer clothes. You could live in a bubble of prosperity while the city crumbled around you. But if you were a teacher, a nurse, a police officer, or a pensioner paid in bolivars, you were destitute. A teacher's monthly salary was $3. A doctor's monthly salary was $10. A police officer would make more money in bribes on a Tuesday than their official salary paid in a month. The inequality was medieval. You had people driving Teslas past homeless children. You had restaurants with $100 steaks while nurses dug through trash for dinner. You had shopping malls with Italian boutiques while hospitals had no gauze. Maduro held on to power through a mix of military loyalty, Cuban intelligence support, and fear. He survived coup attempts in 2019. He survived mass protests. He survived international sanctions. He survived the Juan Guaido experiment, when the opposition leader declared himself president and was recognized by 50 countries, but couldn't actually take power. Maduro controlled the military by letting them run the drug trade and the gold mines. He controlled the population through fear. The secret police, the Sabine, would disappear anyone who spoke too loudly. He controlled the opposition by banning them from running for office or forcing them into exile. He seemed unshakable. Analysts said he would die in office, like Castro. Until January 3rd, 2026. Last week, under the cover of darkness, U.S. Special Forces launched Operation Absolute Resolve. The details are still classified, but here's what we know. The operation involved Navy SEALs, Delta Force operators, and CIA assets who had been positioning themselves for months. Intelligence had been gathered by Venezuelan dissidents, satellite surveillance, and electronic intercepts. At 2:47 a.m. local time, helicopters descended on the Miraflores Palace in central Caracas. Within minutes, they had breached the compound. There was minimal resistance. The palace guards, unpaid for months and demoralized, largely stood down. They found Maduro in his bunker beneath the palace, surrounded by stacks of cash and gold bars. By 6 a.m., he was on a C-17 transport plane heading to the United States. By Monday morning, he was in handcuffs in a federal courthouse in Manhattan, charged with narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, money laundering, and crimes against humanity. The markets reacted instantly. Venezuelan bonds, which had been trading for pennies on the dollar, spiked 200% in a single day. Oil traders started betting on a recovery. International companies began positioning themselves to return. But the reality on the ground is grim. The U.S. is now effectively managing a failed state. The infrastructure is rusted. The power grid collapses daily. The water treatment plants don't work. The roads have potholes the size of cars. The oil wells are clogged with debris. The refineries are operating at 10% capacity. The skilled workers, the engineers, the doctors, the teachers, are all driving Ubers in Madrid or Miami. They have new lives now. Why would they return to a country with no electricity, no water, and no functioning economy? The international community is talking about a Marshall Plan for Venezuela, a massive reconstruction effort that would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. But who will pay for it? The U.S., the EU, the World Bank? And even if the money comes, even if the infrastructure is rebuilt, even if oil production recovers, what then? Because Venezuela's problem was never a lack of money. Venezuela's problem was an addiction to easy money. So, what is the lesson for us? Venezuela proves that natural resources are not wealth. They are a lottery ticket. If you give a lottery ticket to a drug addict, it will kill them faster. If you give a lottery ticket to a disciplined investor, it will build an empire. Norway found oil in the North Sea in 1969, the same year Venezuela was celebrating its riches. Norway took the oil revenue and put it in a bank account called the Government Pension Fund Global. They couldn't touch it. The money was invested in global stocks and bonds. Today, that fund is worth $1.7 trillion, $320,000 for every Norwegian citizen. Norway treated the oil as a temporary bonus, not a permanent salary. The UAE found oil and diversified aggressively. They built Dubai into a global financial hub. They invested in airlines, real estate, and technology. Today, oil is only 30% of their economy. Botswana found diamonds and avoided the curse. They established transparent governance, invested in education, and saved for the future. They are now the fastest growing economy in Africa. Venezuela found oil and treated it as a permanent salary. They built a society that was addicted to a single commodity. They stopped making things, stopped innovating, stopped saving. When the price of that commodity crashed, the society crashed with it. But here is the deeper truth. This isn't just about countries. This is about you. How many people do you know who had a high-paying job, lived like a millionaire, and then got laid off and lost everything? How many companies dominated their industry and then went bankrupt because they failed to adapt? How many families built wealth and then lost it in a single generation? The lesson is simple, but brutal. Diversification is not just investment advice, it is survival. Whether you are a country or a person, if you rely on one source of income, one skill, one asset, one product, you are only one bad day away from zero. Venezuela in 1970 was rich. Venezuela in 2026 is a humanitarian crisis. The difference wasn't socialism or capitalism or democracy or dictatorship. The difference was that they built their entire civilization on a foundation of easy money. And when that money disappeared, everything collapsed. Today, January 2026, marks the end of the Maduro era. But it will take 30 years to fix the damage. An entire generation has been lost. 7 million people are scattered across the globe. The institutions have been destroyed. The trust has been shattered. The Venezuelan flag still flies over Caracas, but the Venezuela of the 1970s, the country that flew the Concorde, that shopped in Paris, that was the envy of Latin America, that country is gone forever. And the lesson is clear. Easy money is the most dangerous drug in the world.